Welcome back for the second half of the Dr. Hildy Show, where today Dr. Hildy and her guests are discussing a variety of art, science, and medicine. For the first half of today's show, or to view all our shows archived for your immediate free download, please visit onecellonelightradio.wordpress.com. And now, here's Dr. Hildy.
Welcome back, audience, and Dr. Seneff. I want to bring out, we just ended the first hour in reference to mechanisms of diabetes, and you brought out the sugars, increased sugars versus decreased sugars. Also in the mechanism with cytochrome P450, as you mentioned earlier, when pesticides interfere with that enzyme or the overstimulation of it, many pesticides can form an overreaction of glucose 6-phosphatate so that then more sugars would be produced. In reality, it's the breakdown of the chemical that is looking like a sugar that stimulates this process. Have you done any work with that aspect?
Not sure if I know. I will say one thing very interesting that I only realized relatively recently with respect to glyphosate, which is that when it breaks down into a product called AMPA, A-M-P-A. I don't remember exactly what that stands for. It's a big, long chemical name. But the other reaction product is glyoxylate, and glyoxylate is actually a very, very strong glycating agent. So glucose is the glycating agent. You know, it gums up the proteins with these, reacts with the proteins and disrupts them so that they can't work properly. Fructose is 10 times as bad as glucose at that same process. And then glyoxylate is probably 10 times again as bad as fructose. It's considerably worse than fructose. So it's a really nasty glycating agent that's produced as a breakdown product of glyphosate. And you don't hear anyone talking about that being a problem, but to me it seems like it surely is. You know,
right.
Once even after you've broken down the glyphosate, you've got a problematic breakdown product.
Right, and that breakdown product is the submetabolite of the original parent compound. And I know in some pesticides you can have one parent compound, which is the active ingredient, and it can make as many as even 18 different other compounds that are all being taken care of by the body or compromising the body.
Yeah, and even sometimes the breakdown product can be worse than the original molecule.
Correct, 100% correct. Now, with we're concentrated on the autism, but with you touched on it earlier in reference to the light coming through the eyes and stimulating the pineal gland to produce the sulfate enzyme. And in particular, it was the 3-O-sulfotransferase, correct?
Right, yes.
Right.
That's the enzyme that gets activated by sunlight. I was delighted to find that article, by the way. I was so thrilled because that was so close to our hypothesis of sulfate being synthesized by sunlight, you know. And then it turns out that the pineal gland has both eNOS and nNOS. These are both different forms of nitric oxide synthase. So it has those two enzymes that we hypothesized produce sulfate, and it produces sulfate in response to sunlight. So that really is almost connecting the dots. You know, no one has actually done the experiment to confirm that we're right with this hypothesis that we have, but the evidence is very strong. The molecule resembles enzymes that are produced by microbes that also produce sulfate. And eNOS is a very unusual CYP enzyme that other CYP enzymes are all involved with sulfate, but eNOS has this nitric oxide that it produces and doesn't seem to be really using its CYP component for producing the nitric oxide. So it's a very mysterious molecule that researchers are puzzling over, and I think when you say that it produces both sulfate and nitrate, it explains a lot about that enzyme, and it's a really intricate design that the body has come up with to have that one single enzyme being a moonlighting enzyme that can do two different things. And then it regulates which thing it's doing depending upon circumstances. So it's a really fancy thing thing that the body has come up with. And in the pineal gland, I think it's really important that it makes that sulfate there.
That connection, to produce it, yes. The thing is, too, we have seen, as scientists, yourself included with me, people that get deprived of sleep, but at the same time, people that live in certain areas of the world, example like in Alaska, Siberia, the upper polar caps, where they have longer extended days, more sunlight or more nighttime. And in this, some of the standard treatment for individuals have been using like a sunlight, like a lamp that has a certain, I want to say, emits a certain amount of photons, or candlelight, so that they can stimulate this interaction, especially like in the winter times where you might have...
Right, well, you have that SAD, right, the syndrome of depression, winter depression, which depression, I think, is very much tied to sunlight deficiency. And of course, it's another problem with the brain. I think that, autism, depression, multiple sclerosis is also known to be more prominent in places that don't get much sun. So
yes.
These diseases of the brain, I think the Alzheimer's too. I mean, in my opinion, you don't want to be wearing sunglasses if you don't want to get Alzheimer's. I really believe in exposing your eyes to the sun. And I would think that would be fantastic therapy for an Alzheimer's person, and get them to sit outside in the sun for long hours and just look at the bright light.
Well, I'll tell you, many remedies in the past, and even in Japan, they have where they used to, sunbathe, a certain amount, and even moonbathe, so many minutes or an hour, without being in our bikinis and being on the beach and getting fried. The other aspect, too, is that many times people don't realize that when their eyes are sensitive to sunlight, where basically you're losing something in your body. You've lost your taurine, and the taurine is a universal detoxifier, when you're doing chemicals secondary to glutathione or vice versa. But the thing is, the first symptom is photosensitivity. Give me those sunglasses, put it over my eyes. My eyes hurt when I see the sunlight. And then the other is night blindness. You can't see the yellow line at night. And but once you start taking that supplement of taurine, you end up being able not to use your sunglasses, etc.
So that's very interesting. So you recommend taurine as a supplement then, right?
Oh, definitely on anyone who is deficient of that due to whatever reason.
So I should explain it because, I mean, you haven't pointed out to the audience, but taurine, of course, is a sulfur-containing molecule. It's actually the only sulfonated amino acid among all the amino acids. It's a very unusual amino acid. And we've written a paper on taurine where we proposed that taurine becomes a source of sulfate under stress conditions. So when you have something like encephalitis in the brain and maybe you get seizures, and those things are necessary to activate a pathway that's going to allow you to pull sulfate out of taurine. So we believe that taurine is actually stored. It is stored in the brain and in the heart and in the liver in large amounts. And we believe that storage is there as a backup system to supply sulfate when all the other systems have failed. And so taurine becomes really, really important as a supply of sulfate, as a backup supply for storage of sulfate.
I can see how it would be very important that way as a backup system in any of this. So a very good point, very good point. So audience, you need to stock up on your taurine.
And you can get it, of course, from cold water fish, right?
Right, and make sure that it doesn't have no radiation and all this other stuff.
I know.
We're sharing a lifetime of exposures, but remember this, audience, and my special guest, we have cosmic genes, too, so that we will overcome all of this. When we shine our light, it's going to really shine through the world, that way. Now, with... any of this, when you were doing your study and your research, one is we all look at the children and the autistic, and even as they grow into adults. How was in your work of what you, I should say, not just your scientific work, but your research, was there an association of generation autism?
Autism from one generation to the next, you mean?
Yes, yes.
I suspect so. I mean, I think you certainly do seem to. Autism does run in families, of course, and there is a genetic component. You know, if you have one child with autism, the sibling is much more likely to have autism. And, in fact, twins are even more strongly both likely to have autism than siblings that are not twins, even twins that are not identical twins, which is very interesting. Because
fraternal twins versus identical
fraternal twins. Yes, so fraternal twins, thank you, are more likely to both have autism. If one has autism, the other one is more likely to have autism by a lot than brothers that are not twins. That's very interesting to me because they don't have any closer genetics. The fraternal twins don't. But what they have is a common environment in the womb.
Correct.
And so I think that part of their mistaking the womb and the environment in the uterus as an influential factor that they're overlooking when they talk about the genetic predisposition. So in other words, they're both in that same impoverished environment.
Right. They're in the same amniotic sac if they're identical
yes.
twins. If they are not, they're in their separate amniotic sac, which is fed, through the placenta, the umbilical cord. And the umbilical cord is the conduit for the filtration of whatever the mother was exposed to that will dump into the baby because the body sees it as its parasite to get rid of. At the same time, I did years ago a case with Dr. Woodward in identical twin fetal transfer where the first baby of that twin, identical twins, it was a sad story because the mother had to carry the dead fetus versus the live fetus for the birth of the second child, but it was the result of exposure to toxic chemicals from the waste of a pharmaceutical industry.
Wow, that's
the area where they lived.
One of the twins died, but the other one lived.
The other one lived, and all concurred, all experts. I was one of them, and also the gynecologist conferred that it was fetal transfer where the first fetus protected the second fetus.
That's very, very interesting.
And at the same time, the baby that was born, it had a tolerance of toxins, but at the same time experienced, problems, GI tract, et cetera, this way.
Right.
But,
so it wasn't completely free, but it was enough. The other one had sacrificed itself so that the other one was able to live.
Right.
I have heard, in fact, you must know Natasha Campbell McBride. Have you heard of her?
Mm-hmm. I've heard of her.
I
don't know
she's
her
the one who first got me caught up into the idea of the gut bacteria dysbiosis in autism, and she's been pursuing that. She's been studying that for many years, and she's had miraculous results in helping autistic kids to heal through her diet program, which of course includes organic diet,
right?
But a whole bunch of other things as well, sort of eliminating certain foods, going into a low-carb diet and a low-sugar diet and all of that, and probiotics and, all these things. But where was I going with that? Oh, so she said in a talk that I heard her give that, and I think you would surely agree with this, that the first child takes the big hit because the mother's been accumulating toxins all her life, and then her body actually uses the baby as an opportunity to unload the toxins. And so the first child gets hit hard with the toxins that the mother may have accumulated, and often then that first child will end as a miscarriage. So actually when you have a miscarriage, you're doing yourself a favor for the next child because you're able to get rid of some of those toxins that would otherwise have caused trouble for the first child that's then successfully born, if you see what I'm saying.
I agree with it. I did a lot of reproductive evaluations over my professional career, and I agree with that. And also blighted ovums, where you have the the fertilization occurred, the embryo reabsorbs back into the body, but the amniotic sac will grow, so the female does need a DNC, etc. But that means when that occurs, just as it occurs in a frog, as in with a human being, is where the oxygen was cut off in that magical time of creation before it was too large so that it could not be reabsorbed into the body. It's amazing how our body is created, and all life within our little planet here.
Right.
Now with the whole aspect, when you were dealing with your work with the sunlight, did you look at because sunlight has a lot of infrared, it has far infrared, it's a composite microwave, it's a composite of all different forms of light, but did you see difference in colors from the different
certainly
spectrum?
Different parts of the spectrum have different roles. And in fact, with respect to this enos molecule that I mentioned earlier, we had a fascinating time studying its which of the rays of the sun would it need, to do its job.
Right.
And we feel that it actually needs infrared, blue light, and ultraviolet, all three. It's very interesting because the enos molecule itself actually it has these flavins attached to it that respond to blue light. And so they absorb blue light and they emit electrons, which is so cool. And then the electrons will cause the oxygen to turn into superoxide. So the oxygen that's just coming in through the skin or through the blood is getting turned into superoxide by the electrons that are being created by the blue light from these flavins. And then the infrared actually is very interesting with respect to the water. And this is work that Gerald Pollack has done, where he has shown that when you shine infrared light on water that's set up in these, he has these tubes that he builds. He works with these wonderful experiments, and he builds these tubes out of these special products that basically simulate the sulfated gags that are along the capillary wall. So he's producing a very simple model of a capillary, and he can show that when you shine light on these things, that the structured water grows by a huge amount, like by a factor of 4. That's the water that's around the sulfate, the special water that's around the sulfate anion. It grows by a large amount. So that really increases the intensity of the whole water-based electric current that's going on in this absolutely fascinating process that life has managed to take advantage of, this really fascinating ability of water to respond to light, create this structured form, and transport current. It's really, really interesting stuff that Gerald Pollack is working on. So that's the infrared. And then the UV light is actually going to excite the water molecules to make them reactive. So it's like all three of those are needed to make this superoxide happen, to make this produce this sulfate.
Right. Now, I want to bring out something with what happens with the calcified pineal gland, as you brought out in your work with the REM sleep cycle. We have talked about the sulfate molecule and its need with the body, but you brought out a very important factor, because I'm seeing baby food saying that it has DHEA in it so that it can help with the baby's brain, etc. But in your work, you brought out that DHA sulfate is needed, not the DHEA.
DHEA sulfate, that's right. DHEA is transported in the blood mostly in a sulfated form. And in fact, it's really interesting when you look systematically at all these molecules that are transported in a sulfated form. There's quite a long list. One of them is vitamin D, by the way, and cholesterol as well. Cholesterol sulfate, vitamin D sulfate, DHEA sulfate, testosterone sulfate, estrogen produces estrone sulfate, progesterone sulfate, and then you have all those neurotransmitters, serotonin sulfate, melatonin sulfate, even thyroid hormone is sulfated. It's just really amazing. All these things are sulfated when they're transported. And the story, what's said in the literature is that the sulfate inactivates the molecule, which is true. So when it's sulfated, it's not active. But they don't mention the fact that if the molecule is sulfated and transit, then the sulfate is actually getting transported. And people miss that point, the fact that it's actually transporting the sulfate as well as the molecule. And I think that is super, super important, that these molecules are actually delivering sulfate to all the cells to which wherever they arrive, they're delivering sulfate, carrying it on their backs.
And you brought out in your work that the DHEA sulfate versus just the plain DHEA injections increase the melatonin production in the rats. So if
that's right, only the sulfated form worked. The other one didn't.
Right. So if you're buying some supplement or something that does not have that sulfate or that sulfur base with it, it's not necessarily going to work on your body. And at the same time, especially if you're looking at enhancing the development of a newborn or a toddler, it's very important that young mothers and grandmothers look at that compound is DHEA sulfate versus not just plain DHEA.
And the same thing is true, by the way, for glucosamine. Glucosamine sulfate and chondroitin sulfate are also important molecules that you can use as supplements, and I think that their supplemental benefit is the sulfate that they're carrying.
It makes total sense. And I also would think that many people also, we look at sleep disorders, schizophrenia, depression, all of that, but people suffer from, chronic fatigue, just can't wake up in the morning. Have you seen a correlation between the sulfated molecules?
I certainly think that chronic fatigue syndrome is related to sulfate deficiency, most definitely. It's also, of course, related to anxiety. Anxiety is a feature of chronic fatigue, as well as brain fog, and so these are all problems with the brain that are related also to the sulfate deficiency, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
Yeah, so there is definitely working. Now, I know you brought out with a little advertisement of Get Your Flu Shot with a new paper that you referenced in 2013, which was in reference to thermosol exposure to the role of sulfonation.
Thimerosal.
In chemistry and thiol availability in autism. In the autistic children, in that article, was there higher thiols produced or lower? Do you know?
I'm having trouble.
I have an interest
exactly
in thiol.
I know that was an article about.
I have to look it up.
About the mercury, right?
Right. It was in reference. It was the Kern. Janet Kern and Boyd Haley.
Right, that's not going to help.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it to go.
I'm trying to remember exactly what that article said, and I'm not sure.
Yeah, audience, we have it attached to this show, not the article, but the reference, so we can all look it up and read it ourselves. I was not to get you off. I just have an interest in thiols and thiophene, so I thought maybe you knew offhand. That's it. But it was so hot that when it came out off the press and in the journals that Seneff, you just had to get it there for us,
Yeah.
So we appreciate it.
I'll go back and refresh my memory on that.
Yeah, don't worry. I have to too.
Phone,
but you don't worry.
I'm not sure exactly what that article said. It is a brand new article, and I
that's what I mean. It was so hot off the press, but you knew it was important, so you put it there.
Right. Yeah, but I'm not remembering exactly which article it was, so I'm not sure what it said, so I can't really elaborate at the moment. But I think it did have to do with sulfur. I won't make anything up. I better not say it.
Don't worry. We're all going to look it up. And we'll all know it, and we'll share the answer between all of us. Okay. Now, with I want to bring out something because many of us have used. I'm going to say suntan lotions or any of these things where, as you brought out in your work, it's the age of aluminum in many aspects, meaning as a fine powder to enhance different polymers or to enhance other creams or, kill bacteria, whatever it may be.
It's used as an emulsifier, and of course it's used in deodorant also, in antiperspirants.
Right. Right.
It's hard to get an antiperspirant without aluminum in it, and I think that's really disturbing. In fact, I think it's connected to breast cancer.
Definitely.
Because the aluminum in the antiperspirant gets into the armpit, it gets into the breast, and can contribute to breast cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, in the sunscreen also, they use the aluminum as an emulsifier, especially the high-end sunscreens that have like really high SPF. They use it as an emulsifier to make it so it's not like a white paste, so it's like more of a transparent, easier to work with kind of substance, cream. It turns it into something more manageable. Mm-hmm. But that's really bad because it creates these aluminum nanoparticles that can get past your skin and get into your cells and disrupt enos.
Right.
Because
right.
aluminum will mess up the synthesis of sulfate. So
right.
not only is it blocking the sunlight, but it's also messing up your body's ability to make the sulfate. So I can imagine over time you could get tremendous damage from an accumulation of aluminum in those cells in your skin that would prevent you from being able to make sulfate even if you were out in the sun without sunscreen. I can imagine that. Now, I haven't proven it, but it makes sense to me.
There's a lot of work going on in reference to nanoparticles and being in the metals or even on the polymer side that they can accumulate on that cell membrane, basically suffocate the cell, or go through that pore of that cell membrane into affecting the organelles, as you brought out with the mitochondria, that it severely depletes ATP. In your work where you were doing with the sunlight, the blue light, etc., ATP is based and functioned by creating approximately 14 molecules to make it go, the energy in the cell, but it needs a certain amount of photons to cause it to generate that ATP. So these metal particles, especially at the smaller surface, areas at the nano or even below. There's now
the nano is
even
so
below
scary.
nano.
It's really scary.
Yeah, I know. I did a paper in reference to silver, and it was a compound that was known as a nano silver, but it accumulated in the body because it was, I'm going to say, misused by not using it as like an antibiotic or something, in 10 days versus thinking that I can just drink the whole bottle. It had levels of 195.
Don't hear much about silver toxicity.
yeah, silver toxicity. And silver is, it even though it's a precious metal, it's the same effects as a heavy metal of lead or anything.
It's not. I don't think it's nearly as toxic as some of the others, but certainly, I suppose, in large amounts it would be. I mean,
it can make it turn blue.
The metals are so interesting because we really depend so much on the micronutrients. All the molybdenum and selenium and cobalt and manganese, all these things that we need in very small amounts are really important. But then, of course, you can have too much. Copper is another one. You need to have the right amount of these things, and it's tricky sometimes to get the right amount. And I think especially with glyphosate, it makes it trickier because I think glyphosate messes up the whole transport system for these things such that they can become you can get into a situation where you have both toxicity and deficiency at the same time because glyphosate has messed up the way it's supposed to work, So it gets into the wrong places and then causes trouble, but doesn't get to the right places and therefore causes deficiency.
That is 100% right. It is so true. And also, you mentioned in reference to selenium, when you have the right amount of selenium with vitamin E, you have the function and the protection, of not making a cancerous tumor. It can be benign, versus the function of vitamin E with vitamin C. One is water-soluble, one's fat-soluble, and they don't work together. But when the presence in the cell membrane of the alpha-lipoic acid, which is the cousin of biotin, they work together synergistically so that it can be like enhancing that antioxidant network. And it all needs a certain amount of these co-minerals, metal formulations, like the coppers, etc. So I'm glad you brought that out because
it's interesting
so
you bring up alpha-lipoic acid because I think that also contains a sulfur. It might even contain two sulfurs. I think it's got sulfur in its molecular structure. The alpha-lipoic acid.
I honestly don't know offhand.
Yeah.
I'd have to look
I'm not
that up.
positive because I'm not sure it's that one, but I think it is. I'll have to go look that up afterwards, but I believe it might have sulfur in it, which is interesting if it's true.
Yeah, and I want to bring out something. You touched on it by just stating in a list of other vitamins and that vitamin K. We know the importance of vitamin K1, 2, and 3 as its association in the mitochondria in the kidney in particular for development. But the thing is, what I have found in my work that as one gets exposed to, one is a lot of chemicals as being pesticides, et cetera, but in particular mold exposures, because molds can break down into many different other compounds within the body and interfere with our natural flora or take over. It basically symbiotically uses every nutrient you have to live within your body versus their mycotoxins. The mycotoxins love to go to the kidneys as with other areas, but I have found that in individuals that have exposed that have a bioethnic relationship to being Polish or Baltic Sea area, they are more prone to kidney disease as associated with overproduction due to the fungus, because the fungus needs the vitamin K too, or those K vitamins, and they in reality are deficient in the kidneys of the vitamin K. So I was very happy that you brought out the need of vitamin K with the sulfates.
Right, and of course the vitamin K is one of the products of that shikimate pathway that glyphosate disrupts.
Mm-hmm.
And vitamin K deficiency can lead to bleeding, and kids that are, so there's kids in Waimea, which is a small town in Kauai that's surrounded by these fields where they're developing new GMO crops and putting all kinds of pesticides, including lots of glyphosate on these fields. And these kids are getting bloody noses, very frequent bloody noses. Their mothers are getting very heavy menstrual cycles, very heavy bleeding during their menstrual period. And I think that this could be connected to vitamin K deficiency due to the influence of the glyphosate on that molecule.
Yeah, it definitely can be. It definitely can.
And I also want to bring up fungus, by the way. Fungus which is mold. That's really, really interesting. When you look at lately, there have been a lot of species that have gone extinct or that are on the verge of going extinct. And then you also have all these, various animals that are suffering right now in crisis. One of those, of course, is the bees, or the bee colony collapse syndrome. You also have bats with the white-nosed bat syndrome.
Oh, yes.
And sorry, I think that must be someone trying to call it. And you have there's a lot of the ladybugs and the monarch butterflies, and then there's the starfish. There's all these different animals that are in stress right now, and that are sick and that are dying, and they don't know why. And I can identify a connection to glyphosate for all of them. Frogs as well. The frogs have been dying out. I mean, we have all these species that are dying out. And there was a paper in Nature recently that talked about fungal infection, and particularly in the United States. I mean, all around the world, animals are going extinct because of various fungus problems. And also, of course, fungus is a major part of the problems with all these different animals I just mentioned, all these species that are in trouble. And glyphosate is known to cause a toxic fungus in plants that releases all these incredibly toxic, as you said, mycotoxins that cause all kinds of damage. That I think that because of the disruption of the bacteria, the glyphosate induces an overgrowth of the fungus, and so when you get the fungus illness, it's a reflection of the poisoning of the glyphosate.
Right,
I think it's all connected.
I agree
and that's
with
happening
you.
in humans too, and that's why we have all this toxic mold problem now that we didn't used to have.
Right,
because the molds are much more toxic in the context of the exposure to these other toxins in the environment.
It enhances it, and at the same time, the fungal infection that, excuse me, the exposure to the fungus is secondary, but because you the glyphosate.
Glyphosate, yeah.
Yeah, glyphosate. We know it's important when I can't say it for some reason, even though it's a simple word. I don't know why. I'm looking at it and I still screw it up. The thing is that with that compound, when it is causing so much havoc in the mechanisms of detoxifying the body, and you're lacking your sulfur because you're just having so many reactions occurring, when you get exposed to this secondary exposure, which is from the fungus, and I'm going to go out there, because it doesn't have the prop in your body as with these other animals, it's so overwhelmed it can't neutralize what is going on in its body. At the same time, I feel that many of this fungus that we're seeing, super opportunistic fungal, even new species, even as you stated, going extinct species of fungus, that it's bringing out, I'm going to say, the fungal's primitive genes of what it originated from, that fungus will be around longer than we all will be.
Right. Fungus is very, very interesting, actually. They're really fascinating. They're a very unique member of the biological system, you know. I want to learn more about fungus because I find them very, very fascinating.
Yeah, they're wonderful. I used to love when I had mycology. It was I loved studying slime molds because they could move. They had a nervous system. I just thought that was amazing how they moved over that petri dish.
And you know, there's that really huge, the biggest biggest biological, what do you say, living thing is a fungus. This huge fungus that's growing in the earth, that's all interconnected underneath and goes for miles and miles. It's all one individual, you know. They all have the same exact genes. Have you heard about that? I forget what it's called.
No, I think that's interesting.
It's a fungus, but it's actually a very useful fungus. It's like the fungus also has like the good and the bad, just like the bacteria do. Mm-hmm. And this one actually is able to help plants communicate with each other. It's really, I've read some fascinating things about it.
Yeah.
It's the biggest living single individual in the world, I think, that they found. You know, this particular, I don't want to say plant, but this particular fungus that was growing.
You're right. It's a fungus.
Yeah.
It's a plant.
Yeah.
It's in that kingdom. You know, it's in that kingdom. And that also explains, we've seen this, and we've all, as scientists, have studied in our biology, the importance of nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which are, you know, basically found in our soils and the root systems of the plants, so that it can exchange, oxygen and nitrogen within those processes. But they have found that where they have high amounts of the nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the systems, there's better, I'm going to call plant communication, just as you brought out. So this is amazing, you know, as it goes in the evolutionary. But they've even spores can fly everywhere, you know?
Yeah, there's a symbiotic relationship. You know, I think there's a lot of symbiosis going on, certainly between us and our gut bacteria and between the plants and these fungi that they use to communicate. There's all this, and of course the fixating bacteria, I mean, all these different symbiotic relationships that different animals have with each other. We should really respect our gut bacteria because they do a lot for us, you know?
Mm-hmm. And take care of them.
Treat them well.
Yeah, I always say to feed them well, take care of them, and remember your ancient heritage so that you can share with your gut the ancient foods you might not like in this lifetime, but your ancestors did, whether it's blue cheese or it's goat cheese or any of these other specialties from all over the world. I want to bring out a thought, the thought being that if you were taking an antioxidant, an anti-gas or for heartburn or anything, which is made up,
like Mylanta, right?
Yeah, or any of those, that is made up of chelated aluminum. Person that would have a high amount of aluminum already in their body, as from taking chronic medication of that type of nature, even if it was over the counter, that they may be more susceptible to the glyphosate.
I know. No, I agree. Well, of course, and also the glyphosate will be more damaging to them because it will allow them to get that aluminum through. It's going to help to promote the aluminum uptake. So very dangerous. Of course, also, if you're taking an antacid, you probably have gut issues, which might mean that you have a leaky gut. That's going to work against you, too. So I can see a sort of perfect storm there.
Yeah. Have you found with the exposure to that compound individuals that have had a higher, I'm going to say a viral count, even if we just look at maybe have a high, not shingles, chickenpox, mumps, measles, any of that, okay? Childhood viral exposures, because viruses love to go to the nervous system and thus the electrical system within our body and its triggers that have you found them to be more prone to autism or any of the, I'm going to call it neurological disorders?
I think I can't really say. I don't have
Okay. I was thinking maybe in your readings or what you've done.
No, I can't. It doesn't. Off the top of my head, I can't point to a paper on that one. So
because I know with a lot of viral exposures, individuals have a lot of what they call post-viral neuralgia. Sometimes electrical firing
in fact, I know there
in
is
the body.
Asia, right? The Asia syndrome. Autoimmune syndrome. I forget what it stands for. You probably don't remember either, right?
No, I don't remember. We're in the same boat. Don't worry.
Yeah.
But I was just
called
thinking
Asia,
aloud.
Which is nice, ASIA, but it's a syndrome that is that's a consequence of a serious, often follows a serious infection of some sort, or a vaccine. It can also cause Asia. So it's and it's a neurological disorder that has similarities to chronic fatigue and things like that.
I'm just going to review some stuff because all of your work brings this out. We've stressed with compounds, whether they're drugs or active ingredients in weed killers or any of this. We have to go through a thought process, which is basically this audience, and we look at the toxic metabolite, we look at the active metabolite, as we just discussed, the inactive metabolites, and the reversible metabolites. What is it going to change? As Dr. Seneff brought out, that if you had DHEA but you didn't have the sulfate with it, that it would not help in making the melatonin. Thus, if you have lower amounts of melatonin, then you have a higher increased risk of other diseases and sleeping disorders. But from that metabolic breakdown in the body, which we know goes through many phases through the liver and the kidney and other mechanisms within the body, we have to look at the toxicity, the altered activity. How is this enhancing the activity? Loss of activity, as you shared, with chronic fatigue and many other symptoms and diseases that may be associated, and the prolonged activity. My concern, too, is the prolonged activity, as you are with Dr. Seneff, is in reference to, say you have the autistic child and they grow up to maturity, they have children. Is that toxicity going? Because we have seen this with lead. I have seen this in my work where lead exposures in a smelting plant operation went from generation to affecting the kidneys in a 2-mile radius versus a 4-mile radius from exposure when the smelting plant was in operation. So I think there's a risk there.
No, well, actually, you did remind me of something really fascinating that I had the pleasure of being exposed to. I got an email from someone who was a descendant of a whole bunch of coal miners from in France. His ancestors were coal miners in France, And he had this absolutely fascinating paper that he was working on. I don't know if he ever got it published. He sent it to me, and he was just commenting to what did I think. But he was explaining to me that within his family, there were a lot of people with, on the autism spectrum. He had way too many relatives on the autism spectrum, and he suspected that it was related to the toxic exposure of his ancestors who were in the mines, and they were getting a lot of mercury. They had sunlight deprivation because they were working in these dark mines. So they had. He thought that there was an epigenetic effect that got remembered in the offspring, such that the later generations had an increased risk to autism as a consequence of the exposure of previous generations, which was really, really fascinating to me. That was what kind of got me to start to think about this whole issue of epigenetics and what I would call Lamarckian evolution,
And I agree with that, because in mining, looking for the precious metals of silver and gold, I was brought out when the Spaniards came into South America and used and also in Central America, rather, the natives there during the Aztec times, that you brought in Cinzabar, and Cinzabar had mercury in it. And at the same time, it would separate out the silver and the gold, but the mercury vapors would cause mental confusion. Bad problems.
Exactly,
not only for the
right?
humans, but for the donkeys and the conquistadors there and the local native population, because they were slaved and worked there. But they have found that in those generations thus forward, that they had that mercury within their system. And Cinzabar also was used in Chinese for longevity. So there is, I think you're going to prove that epigenetic relationship and small molecules within the molecules of those atoms.
Yeah, so it's fun. It's interesting stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And, with the enhanced activity with the compounds that we've discussed today, that it can bring out a change not only in the nucleic acids, but the enzymes, as you shared, by so many enzymes that have sulfur and so many that do not. The transport of those proteins within the system, the cell signaling of those proteins. You may not send the right message to the cell, so it doesn't know what to do. The receptors may be calcified and thus not receive the signal. And then any other types of proteins that might be associated. The end result is you're going to have either carcinogenicity, genetic toxicity, necrosis, adaptosis, and also hypersensitivity. I have seen in many times when you get overexposed to a compound that we recognize as a toxin, that your mechanisms were overwhelmed, that it could not detoxify, that antibody is still, the antigen came in, which is the chemical, and it made the antibodies on the protein, and thus you have various stages of hypersensitivity, in particular, as we've seen in chemical sensitivities, because the chemical sensitivities are so overwhelming because it's all the mechanisms are interacting in that situation.
Yeah, and I think as the person I know people, because I get email from people who have experienced even just a single episode. There was one woman that shared with me about herself and her two dogs, and they were just walking, taking a walk, and they happened to, unfortunately, basically run into, or get too close to this sprayer that was spraying something, which was glyphosate plus something else, I think. And so she got this head-on exposure to this in sort of a single event. And from then on, all three of them were very, very unhealthy, just from that one event. And so people can get a single event that can then just really wreck their entire system such that they can no longer handle any toxic chemicals in their environment. They become very hypersensitized. It's really scary.
Right, and sometimes
I was very surprised to hear that it could just be one event that would do that.
Right, because they might be a slow metabolizer. They may not they may have had their DNA switch off, trigger a switch off of an enzyme that they can't neutralize, the compounds coming in. Yeah. It all goes back to either their past history of exposure, as with other things, like you brought out with the individual that contacted you that was in the coal mining.
Yeah.
When we look at the black carbon, there's the brown coal, which is more lignite. It's different grades of coal because the brown has more sulfur in it. At the same time, in the procedures of cleaning out the coal, because the particulates interfere with even their B vitamins for the methylation, and besides having autism, they end up having heart attacks because they end up having arterial sclerosis, which basically is lack of vitamin B6, but no one's really studying that in the relationship. And it goes back to your good cholesterol, bad cholesterol. Cholesterol, period, is a function of what is happening in the body, as you brought out with cholesterol sulfur-based.
Yeah. Well, so, actually, I have an interesting story about cholesterol sulfate, because I believe that if you get plenty of sunlight exposure to your skin, then your skin produces a lot of cholesterol sulfate, and that's actually a fabulous way to transport sulfate to the tissues, because the sulfated form of cholesterol is both water-soluble and fat-soluble, so it makes it very easy to transport. If you don't produce enough cholesterol sulfate, then your liver has to produce cholesterol and has to ship it out in these LDL particles. So you have to raise your LDL to compensate for the fact that you don't have enough cholesterol sulfate synthesis from the skin. And if you look, you'll see that places that are very sunny and that are in low latitudes have much lower heart disease risk than the northern places or the rainy places. It's quite a linear relationship between the amount of availability of the sun in that environment and the amount of heart disease that is occurring in that population. It's quite interesting.
And I bet with your work that you'll find that the cholesterol sulfate, because it's, as you stated, it's accumulative, it's primarily in the skin where you need the sun and everything, but we know that arsenic accumulates in the sun. So the cholesterol sulfate may be binding the arsenic, so it's trying to protect yourself, but at the same time, when we get into the sun, it increases the risk of melanoma. So I hope you figure out that mechanism. So it'll help a lot of people.
When you look at melanoma, and you look at sunscreen usage has gone up 30-fold in the last 30 years, because they've been encouraging us more and more to use sunscreen in higher and higher SPF levels. And at the same time, the rate of melanoma in the skin has gone up 2 or 3% every year ever since we started harassing people to wear sunscreen. I actually think the sun's causing the melanoma. It's making the situation worse. Your body knows how to protect itself from the sun, and it will pick up a healthy tan if you can just use the spring sun to give yourself a healthy tan going into the summer. You're much better off than if you keep yourself very white and rely on using sunscreen all the time to protect yourself from the sun. This is my opinion.
Mm-hmm. It makes sense to me, because many of the titanium oxides that are used and the zinc oxides that are used in these suntan lotions, meaning higher SPF values, meaning the amount that they have in it, is basically trying to block the sun rays, but at the same time, your skin is absorbing it. And
right, and you see there's zinc actually in this enos molecule that makes the sulfate, and I suspect that the whole process of making the sulfate and using the zinc is actually also a process to protect you from the UV light. So the body knows how to use that UV very effectively and put it to good use. The body actually loves to have the UV because it's a source of energy, but it needs to know how to use it correctly, and as long as it can do that, you leave it alone and let it do it the way it's supposed to, it will do a great job, and it will do a better job than any kind of chemical you could put on your skin to protect you from the melanoma. So, people know that UV light can generate, DNA mutations. People know that, and they think that we can protect by just putting some kind of a chemical on our skin. But when you think about how smart biology is, you have to think that our skin must have figured out how to protect itself from the sun,
Right.
So
Very good point.
You're trading
very
off.
Good point.
Yeah, it's just it never seems to work, in my opinion, to try to use some chemical to improve upon biology, because biology is really smart. That's one thing I've come to appreciate.
Mm-hmm. Have you found with the compound, the glyphosate, that there is an increased risk of heat shock proteins? Because that
heat
is
shock
when you
proteins,
when you feel that warming sensation in the body, let alone from the niacin or anything. Overstimulation, I wonder.
Right, I know. The heat shock proteins are interesting, and I haven't adequately researched them. I've certainly seen papers that talk about the heat shock proteins, and I believe that they stimulate nitric oxide synthesis. So that is causing enos to make nitric oxide instead of sulfate when you have the heat shock. So I think it's an indicator that your system wants to make the nitric oxide. So nitric oxide will actually do interesting things. It causes the blood to relax, and it causes the blood to circulate, and it also attacks the extracellular matrix and breaks off pieces of the heparan sulfate and can distribute them down the road. So I think it's a way to distribute sulfate that's being produced in the artery wall and to deliver it to the capillary, because the capillary needs to keep its sulfate supplies high in order to maintain a healthy flow of the blood. And so I think the artery actually produces these heparan sulfate molecules, and then the nitric oxide produces this nitrite which attacks them and breaks off pieces and allows the capillary to get supplied. So it's a really interesting delivery system of heparan sulfate to the capillaries and when the nitric oxide is released. And I think that is in response to the heat shock. So I think it's a switch that decides which way to go, whether to be making sulfates or whether to be breaking them down.
Right, and that we're going to study in the future, Dr. Seneff. I hear our music in the background.
Oh, okay, wow, that was quick.
I tell you, perfect timing, but at the same
quickly.
time, I hope with your schedule and our schedule that we'll have you back again so we can share some more of your in-depth research. And
it was a great conversation. I appreciate
it was my pleasure,
so.
And I appreciate your work, and I'm glad that it's continuing, and it's going to have a lot of good information for future scholars and scientists so that we have these answers so that there's less diseases in the world and less chemical exposures. And that's why
we can get that message out, yes.
Yes, and remember, your primary compound you love is the sulfur, and if you ever get toxic exposure, you can at least go and get a jar or a can of sauerkraut. It has high amount of sulfur, so it will help you out in detoxing.
That's a great idea, plus the probiotics.
Yes. Take care. God bless.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the Dr. Hildy Show on the One Cell, One Light Radio Network. For the other half of today's show, or to view all of our shows archived for your immediate-free download, please visit onecellonelightradio.wordpress.com. This is Mark the Arcturian speaking for the Dr. Hildy Show, a One Cell, One Light radio production.